She was the woman no one looked at twice. A quiet secretary in a beige cardigan, working late, eating lunch alone, and always staying out of the way. At 35, Maggie Whitman had given up on love. She was too tired to dream and too busy surviving. Her world was built around routines, caring for a mother who no longer remembered her name, and holding together an office that never thanked her. So, when a room full of coworkers laughed at her, again, she said nothing. But someone else did. Why would a powerful CEO famous for being distant walk into that moment and kiss the most invisible woman in the room? What did he see in her that no one else ever had? And more importantly, would she believe it for herself? This isn't a story about being rescued. It's about being seen, and how that changes everything. If you've ever felt overlooked, unappreciated, or told you were too small to matter, this story is for you. Stay with us. And if you believe in quiet strength and second chances, share and subscribe to Shining Stories. Let's begin. It was Maggie's least favorite kind of morning, cloudy but not raining, cold but not enough to justify a scarf, and filled with the kind of office tension that clung to your skin like static. She'd skipped breakfast, again. The bus was late, again. And she'd spilled half her lukewarm coffee on the sleeve of her one good cardigan while rushing through the security doors of Midwest Home Tech. That morning felt like a sigh stretching across the hours. Still, she was on time. She was always on time. Margaret Whitman, known to most as Maggie, had worked at Midwest Home Tech for 9 years, 8 months, and 11 days. She'd never missed a deadline. She knew how every department filed their reports, who had food allergies, and where the backup toner was hidden in the supply closet. If the office had a pulse, Maggie was its quiet heartbeat, unnoticed, reliable, and strangely essential. But today wasn't about her. It was the quarterly awards ceremony, which meant balloons, overly sweet punch, and paperweights shaped like light bulbs to reward bright ideas. It meant suits worn tighter than personalities, and laughter pitched just loud enough for the managers to hear. Maggie sat near the back, hands folded in her lap, legs crossed at the ankle. She wore a gray skirt that had faded softly over the years, and a pale blue blouse she'd pressed that morning while her mother babbled about recipes from 1978. The nurse at the care facility had told Maggie her mother was having a good cognition day. Though Maggie knew better than to get her hopes up, she hadn't planned to come today. But attendance was strongly encouraged, and she'd never been one to cause a fuss. The room buzzed with applause as Barbara Knox took the microphone. Vice President of Marketing, 42, blonde, and calculated in every syllable she uttered. Her red heels clicked louder than the mic's feedback. And last, but not least, Barbara chirped, "We want to give a special shout-out to someone who's been with us so long. We're pretty sure she predates the building." The crowd chuckled. Maggie felt her name before she heard it. It curled at the back of her throat like steam from bad coffee. "Come on, Maggie, stand up. Don't be shy." She stood quietly, offering a modest smile, a few polite claps. A younger analyst she didn't know well gave her a thumbs up. Barbara wasn't finished. "You all know Maggie," she said, gesturing vaguely. "Our very own front desk guardian, scheduling wizard, and unofficial office mom." Another wave of laughter. Not cruel, exactly just dismissive, like someone patting a dog on the head and saying, "Good girl." Barbara leaned in a little, her voice low but make still live. "Still no ring, Maggie. Guess some of us marry the job? Huh?" That one landed hard. Laughter, real laughter this time. A few people turned to look at her, some smiling, some wincing, and some just trying not to make eye contact. Maggie felt her cheeks grow warm, her spine stiffened. She didn't laugh. She didn't smile. She stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from restraint. Barbara moved on, handing out more awards, more plastic trophies, more reasons for people to feel important. Maggie sat down. Her chair creaked slightly beneath her. She folded her hands again. She thought about her mother. She thought about the cardigan she couldn't afford to replace. She thought about how, after all these years, She could still be reduced to a punchline, but she didn't cry, she didn't run. Instead, she looked straight ahead toward the stage where fake smiles passed for gratitude and thin applause passed for connection. She thought, I am invisible to these people, and somehow, that hurt less than trying to be seen. The laughter faded. The ceremony moved on. Someone was speaking about next quarter's goals, but the words blurred into background noise. Maggie's gaze drifted to the double doors at the back of the room, near the catering table and the coat rack that still held her old navy trench coat. She calculated how quickly she could leave without drawing attention. Her fingers twitched slightly against her palm, and then the doors opened, not loudly, no grand entrance, just the soft, unmistakable sound of weighted hinges swinging apart. Heads turned, not all at once, but in waves like wheat in the wind. Standing in the doorway was a man most of them had only seen in investor newsletters and the occasional elevator ride that felt like a religious experience. Jonathan Pierce, CEO of Midwest Home Tech. Widowed, private, mysterious. The subject of more than one. Is he dating anyone? A conversation in the break room. He didn't wear a tie. His navy suit was pressed, but his hair held a streak of rebellion that made him seem younger than 45. He carried nothing, not a folder, not a phone, just himself. And he was looking directly at Maggie, not at Barbara, not at the stage, not at the crowd, at her. Every voice in the room seemed to lower in volume, as if the air itself had grown hesitant. Maggie's heart began to thud, not out of romance, not out of hope, but out of a fear she didn't understand. He took a step forward, then another, and another. There was something about the sound of expensive shoes on old carpet. It wasn't loud, it wasn't fast, but every step Jonathan Pierce took seemed to carry weight, like even gravity paid attention when he moved. He didn't scan the room, he didn't wave, or nod, or acknowledge the sea of mid-level executives frozen in their places. His eyes were fixed steady, direct on one person, Maggie Whitman. She didn't move, couldn't, really. Her palms, once tucked calmly in her lap, had gone rigid. Her breath had shortened, caught halfway between confusion and disbelief, and her mind, usually sharp, practical, good at compartmentalizing, was suddenly useless. He kept walking. The air shifted around him. You could feel it like the heat trailing behind a storm door left ajar in January. Whispers stopped before they could form. Plastic cups filled with red punch were forgotten mid-sip. Even Barbara Knox, still holding the mic, lowered it halfway to her side. Jonathan was tall, not towering, but just enough to make the space around him feel smaller. His navy wool coat was open, revealing a charcoal sweater and slacks that moved like fabric was meant to when worn by someone who never rushed. He had the kind of face that once knew laughter, but had learned to keep it for himself. Silver traced the edges of his hair, not out of style, but out of life. And still, he looked only at her. When he reached Maggie's row, he paused. One heartbeat, two, then, as if the world hadn't already stopped. He stepped sideways into the narrow aisle, directly in front of her. Her throat tightened. He didn't speak, not yet. Instead, he dipped his head just slightly, with a grace that felt out of time, and leaned forward. What happened next was not loud, not dramatic, not romantic, even. It was precise. A kiss, soft and brief, pressed gently to Maggie's left cheek, not possessive, not performative. It felt, somehow, like punctuation, like a period placed gently at the end of a sentence too long ignored. No one moved. It wasn't the kind of kiss people expected in front of a crowd. It wasn't a kiss that belonged to office gossip or whispered speculation. It was quieter than that, older than that, and perhaps that's why it shook the room. Maggie's breath caught, not because of the kiss itself, but because of the way he looked at her after, like she was real, like she'd been seen. She hadn't realized how long it had been since someone looked at her that way. Jonathan straightened. He turned not to the crowd, not to the microphone still limply held in Barbara's manicured fingers, but to the open space in the middle of the room. and with the same calm tone one might use when commenting on the weather, he said, "She deserves better." 3 words, simple, unarguable. Then he walked away, no dramatic pause, no lingering glance. Just a quiet exit through the same doors he had entered. And still, no one moved. Maggie remained seated, back straight, hands now clenched in her lap. Her right hand was pressing into the worn fabric of her canvas bag, an old thing with frayed straps and a broken zipper that she'd meant to replace for months. The imprint of his lips on her cheek hadn't faded, but it hadn't spread either. It was like a single warm spot left behind by sunlight before the clouds rolled back in. She didn't look around. Didn't seek the reactions, the stares, the tightening of jaws or the slackening of them. She simply sat there, utterly still. For once, the silence wasn't hers alone. Eventually, someone coughed, a shuffle of feet, a plastic fork dropped onto a paper plate. Barbara fumbled to regain control, murmuring something about moving on, thanking everyone for their hard work, trying to smile like her mouth hadn't just betrayed her. Maggie stood, not quickly, not to run, just to stand. She adjusted the strap on her bag, brushed a wrinkle from her skirt, and turned toward the door. No one stopped her. No one dared. The echo of her shoes was softer than his had been, but somehow, they still sounded like a declaration. Each step away from the room was a step towards something she didn't yet have a name for. She reached the hallway. The carpet here was thicker, the air cooler. Her hand trembled slightly as she pressed the elevator button, but not from fear, not even from confusion. It was something else, something new, something almost like dignity. She didn't know what had just happened. Not really. She didn't know why the CEO of the company, the man who hadn't been seen at a single awards event in years, would show up unannounced and break the unspoken laws of professional distance in 3 measured steps. She didn't know why he kissed her, or why he spoke at all. But as she stepped into the elevator and the doors began to close, Maggie saw her reflection in the mirrored panel. She didn't look different, but for the first time in a long while, she saw the outline of a woman who might just maybe still matter. The email arrived quietly, as if it didn't want to make a fuss. Subject: coffee. From Janice Sterling. Time: 8:13 a.m. Message. Mr. Pierce requests a coffee. Your preferred place. Anytime today after 2 p.m. No, please, no explanation. Just those few simple lines. Maggie stared at the screen a little longer than necessary, rereading the words like they might rearrange themselves into something more ordinary. But they didn't. And Janice was not the kind of woman to send an email by accident. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for several seconds before she finally typed 2:30 p.m., Paper Finch Cafe, corner of Hennepin and 12th. She hit send before she could think better of it. Paper Finch wasn't the kind of place anyone from upper management would normally step into. It was tucked beside a laundromat, with 2 small tables inside and 4 more lining the sidewalk. The coffee wasn't great, but the morning light was soft through the dusty windows, and the barista knew her by name. Maggie had been going there for years, quiet mornings before work, weekend afternoons with a dog-eared paperback, or sometimes just to sit and feel like a person outside the office. At 2:28 p.m., she was already seated at the far table, nearest the window. Her coat was folded neatly beside her, hands around a chipped ceramic mug. She didn't know if he would really come. Maybe it was a mistake, or maybe he had changed his mind. But then, at 2:30 exactly, the door opened. He didn't bring a briefcase. No assistant trailed behind him, no black car idled outside. Just Jonathan Pierce, in a charcoal sweater that looked softer than anything she'd ever owned. Sleeves rolled to the elbow, collar slightly askew, like he'd pulled it over his head in a rush. No tie, no watch, just a man and his silence. He saw her instantly, gave a single nod, and walked over. Maggie stood as he approached out of politeness, not protocol. He smiled gently, then gestured for her to sit. She obeyed, heart ticking faster than her expression betrayed. No one in the cafe seemed to recognize him, or if they did, they kept it to themselves. He ordered a black coffee, no sugar, no milk, and when he returned, he didn't pull out a phone or a notebook. He simply sat across from her, hands loosely clasped in front of him. For a long moment, they just sat, not awkwardly, not uncomfortably, like two people who understood that sometimes silence was the most honest language. When he finally spoke, it wasn't about yesterday. It wasn't about the room full of laughter, or the stunned expressions, or the way her name had lingered in the air like smoke. It was about his mother. She was a secretary. He said simply. Maggie blinked. She raised me alone, small desk in a big building, the kind where the marble floors made your shoes echo, but no one remembered your name. He paused to sip his coffee, as if the bitterness helped him measure the memory. She was the reason the place didn't fall apart, but no one ever thanked her for it. Maggie nodded slowly. She didn't say much, just enough to show she was listening. She always listened. It was something people rarely noticed until they needed it. She passed 10 years ago, he added. I never forgot the way she smiled when someone finally called her by her title. Not just, hey you, not just, can you take notes? She was proud of being Mrs. Pierce, administrative coordinator. Like the words gave her shape. Maggie felt a lump rise in her throat. She didn't expect it, but it was there. I think she'd have liked you, he said softly. The words sat between them like a gift no one quite knew how to unwrap. Maggie took a slow breath. Outside, the city moved on, cars rolled past, leaves tumbled along the curb, someone in the laundromat laughed too loud. But here, in this small cafe on the corner of two forgettable streets, something unspoken was finding its voice. She looked down at her mug. The surface of the coffee had gone still. I've worked there 9 years, she said, her voice quiet but steady. People forget. Not just my name, my presence. I pass out memos and reminders and seating charts, but I don't think anyone really sees me anymore. Jonathan didn't interrupt. He just listened, fully, completely. The kind of listening that pulled honesty from the cracks of guarded hearts. I don't need praise, she continued, but sometimes I wonder what it would feel like to be more than useful. She stopped. Embarrassed by her own vulnerability, he didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. His voice was lower now, gentler. Sometimes, the people we ignore are the ones holding the walls up. That was all he said, but it was enough. Maggie didn't cry, not here, not in public, but something loosened in her chest, like a knot that had been tied too tightly for too long. When he stood to leave, she did too. They didn't shake hands, didn't exchange numbers. There was no promise of another meeting, just a quiet understanding like something had been acknowledged, finally, after years of pretending it didn't exist. He held the door for her as she walked out, then turned the opposite direction and disappeared into the hum of city life. That evening, Maggie returned to her apartment. She hung up her coat, fed her cat, turned off the TV she hadn't really been watching. Then, for no particular reason, she looked around, same couch, same chipped countertop, same stack of medical bills on the kitchen table, but somehow, it didn't feel like a hiding place anymore. It felt like a space waiting to be claimed, and she wasn't sure when that shift had happened, only that it had. The day started wrong and kept finding new ways to go worse. Maggie had spilled coffee on her cream-colored blouse before she'd even left the apartment. She tried to blot it with a paper towel, but the stain bloomed like rust. She changed into a wrinkled shirt she hadn't planned on wearing, then missed the bus by less than a minute. The next one came late and rattled like it was held together by string and memory. By the time she arrived at Midwest Home Tech, her nerves already felt threadbare. The elevator hummed too loud. The air smelled faintly of someone's cologne, a scent she couldn't place, but that made her feel small, like she was in someone else's world. Her desk, usually her sanctuary of quiet routine, greeted her with fresh irritation. Her pen had leaked inside her drawer, blue ink staining her fingers as she reached for it. The calendar was skewed. A post-it note had fallen onto the floor and stuck to her shoe. Still, she smiled when she sat down. A small, tired smile. The kind you wear when no one's looking. Barbara was the first to break the morning silence. "Well, someone's had a rough start," she called from across the room, voice dripping with sugar and vinegar. "Don't worry, Maggie. We've all had days where we forget to try." A few people chuckled. Maggie didn't respond. She just turned slightly in her chair, looked out the window, and let the comment pass over her like wind through a screen door. But something inside her shifted, something she didn't quite have the strength to hold back. Her stapler sat slightly off kilter on her desk. A small, familiar object, solid, dependable. She reached for it, trying to center herself, trying to focus on the ordinary. It broke, not dramatically, not loudly, just a soft crack as the hinge gave out in her hand. It was too much. She bent to pick up the pieces, just two small parts in a spring, but she stayed crouched longer than necessary. That's when the tears came. Not sobbing, not theatrical, just quiet. Uninvited tears that blurred her vision and soaked into the inside of her sleeves as she pressed them to her eyes. She didn't stand right away. She didn't want to. The carpet smelled faintly of old coffee. Her knee ached from the angle. But the floor, somehow, felt safer than the desk just then. When she finally stood, she didn't say a word. She walked straight to the bathroom, clutching the broken stapler in her palm like a relic. The restroom was empty. She locked herself in the farthest stall and sat on the closed toilet seat, breathing through her mouth to steady herself. Then she pulled out her phone. There were 2 missed calls from Maple Glen Memory Care. She didn't need to listen to the voicemail. She already knew. Her mother had wandered again. They'd found her in the parking lot the night before, confused and cold, staring at the streetlight like it might tell her where she'd left her wedding ring. "She keeps saying someone's waiting for her," the nurse had said last time. "Someone named Joe. Do you know who that is?" Yes, Maggie knew. Joe was her father. He'd been gone 21 years. Maggie ended the call. She didn't have the energy to listen. She sat there for another 5 minutes, maybe 10. The light above her flickered slightly, the way fluorescent bulbs do when they're nearing their end. When she finally splashed water on her face and stepped out of the stall, she didn't expect to see anyone. But he was there, leaning gently against the tiled wall across from the sink. Jonathan Pierce. His hands were in his pockets, his coat folded over one arm. He wasn't blocking her path or intruding on her space. He was just there, waiting. Not impatiently, not expectantly, just waiting, as if presence alone could offer steadiness. She froze for a moment, not from embarrassment, not even from surprise, but from the strange sensation of being met exactly where she was in the middle of the mess. He didn't ask if she was okay, didn't press her with words she wasn't ready to answer. Instead, after a breath, he spoke softly. "Would you mind coming with me for a drive?" No explanation, no pressure, just that. She didn't ask where, or why, or how long. She simply nodded, because sometimes, when the world starts to come apart, what you need most is someone willing to walk beside you without needing to fix it. The cabin wasn't large, it wasn't grand, but it was quiet. Tucked just beyond the trees outside Stillwater, the structure leaned slightly against the slope of the land, like it had long since stopped trying to impress anyone. The wooden porch creaked beneath their feet as Jonathan unlocked the door, then pushed it open with a soft grunt and a flick of his wrist that suggested muscle memory more than urgency. Maggie hesitated on the threshold. It wasn't fear that kept her still. It was the unfamiliarity of being led somewhere without an agenda. No explanations, no small talk, just presence. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old paperbacks, the kind of scent that wrapped around your bones and whispered, "You're safe now." Rain had begun to fall harder by the time she stepped inside. Not a polite drizzle, but the kind of autumn storm that made wind rattle through the window frames like a stranger demanding entry. Maggie wrapped her arms around herself out of instinct, not cold. Jonathan didn't rush. He hung up his coat, moved toward the fireplace, and began stacking logs like he'd done it 1,000 times. No words, just motion, just the crackle of kindling and the rustle of flame. Within minutes, the power went out, a flicker, then black. He didn't curse or scramble for switches. He simply struck a match, lit the old lantern on the shelf, and placed it gently on the table between them. The glow was soft, golden, imperfect. Maggie found herself breathing slower in its light. She sat on the floor by the hearth, knees tucked beneath her, palms curled around a warm ceramic mug he had handed her without a word. Tea, slightly bitter, but comforting. Jonathan sat in the chair beside the fireplace, close, but not touching. One leg crossed over the other, sleeves pushed to his elbows, hair slightly damp at the temples from the run through the rain. For a while, neither of them spoke. The storm did all the talking, rattling branches, distant thunder, the soft hiss of rain slipping down the chimney. It filled the space without pressing in. And then, quietly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he began. "I had a daughter," he said. Her name was Sophie. Maggie turned slightly, eyes finding the profile of his face in the firelight. "She was 8, he continued, loved giraffes, hated oatmeal, thought the word Wednesday was the most ridiculous thing ever created." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We lost her in a car accident, 3 blocks from home. A man ran a red light, drunk, I think, or distracted, or both." Maggie didn't speak, just listened. "My wife, we didn't survive it either. Not really. We stopped talking, then we stopped sleeping in the same bed, and eventually we stopped being 2 people who knew how to live in the same life." He shifted slightly, elbows resting on his knees, gaze focused on the flames. "That's when I started coming here. The city. It got too loud after that. The sympathy, the calendars full of nothing, the silence in a child's room, a long breath. I built that bench outside myself. Took me 3 weeks and more mistakes than I'd care to admit. Sophie would have laughed. She always laughed when I messed things up." Maggie felt the tightness in her chest ease, not from relief, but from recognition. She traced the rim of her mug with her thumb. "He was my manager," she said softly. "At my last job, not at Home Tech." Jonathan looked up. "I was 28. Naive, I guess. He made me feel seen, promised me a future, told me I was the only thing that kept him sane." A bitter smile touched her lips, the kind people learn after they've stopped crying. He got what he wanted, then disappeared. A new promotion, a new city. I heard he married someone from HR 6 months later. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was respectful. He said I wasn't ambitious enough, she added, that I didn't push hard enough, that I was too good at being invisible. Jonathan didn't flinch, but his voice, when he spoke, held a quiet edge. "I've met too many people who mistake softness for absence." Maggie turned to look at him. The rain softened against the roof. Thunder rolled somewhere farther now, like a conversation had reached its final note. She didn't plan to ask it, but the question rose, unbidden, from somewhere deeper than logic. "Why did you kiss me that day?" she asked. He didn't look surprised. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he leaned forward just slightly, elbows still on his knees, hands laced loosely together. "Because I saw them trying to erase you." The words didn't hang in the air, they landed. Solid, true. "And I've watched too many good people disappear without anyone noticing," he added. "Not because they failed, but because no one bothered to say, 'I see you.'" Maggie swallowed hard. She didn't cry. Not now. But something inside her, something fragile and long, silent, stood up. Not in defiance, not in gratitude, just stood. The fire popped softly, as if echoing the truth just spoken. Outside, the storm had slowed, the wind was tired, the trees no longer strained. Inside, the silence remained, but it was no longer lonely. Maggie had always known the office was too bright, Not in a cheerful way, but in that sterile overhead buzz that flattened everything into sameness. It hummed in corners and highlighted every paper out of place, every wrinkle in a blouse, every moment you hesitated too long to speak. This morning, it hummed louder than usual. She arrived early, as always. Coat still damp at the edges from the weekend's storm. Hair tied back in a simple knot. Neutral lipstick, calm exterior, but inside something unsettled. The drive back from the lake had been quiet. Jonathan hadn't said much after they returned to the city. He'd dropped her off 3 blocks from her apartment, saying only, "Take care, Maggie," before the door clicked shut behind her. And she had taken care of her cat, of her mother's paperwork, of her own thoughts that scattered like leaves across the floor of her mind. But this morning felt different, and not in a good way. She passed Jonathan in the hallway at 9:12 a.m. He didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't look at her, just a crisp, focused stride in his navy suit, tablet in hand, earpiece in place, the image of command, the kind of man who made decisions in margins and headlines. She stood there for a second too long after he passed, just long enough for Janice, his assistant, to glance at her not unkindly, but with the knowing look of someone who'd learned not to ask questions. The weekly department meeting began at 10:00 sharp. Barbara arrived 5 minutes late, coffee in hand, her heels clicking like punctuation. She wore a shade of lipstick that looked expensive and sharp, the kind that made you wonder how much of her power came from what she chose to show and what she chose to withhold. Maggie took her usual seat at the far end of the table, legal pad open, pen already uncapped. Jonathan entered last. His voice was cool, professional. He addressed the agenda, delegated tasks, outlined deadlines. He didn't look at Maggie once. It shouldn't have hurt. After all, she was no stranger to invisibility. But after firelight and silence, after pain poured gently between 2 tired hearts, this kind of distance cut deeper. Had it meant nothing? Was she just a passing kindness? A moment of shared grief he'd already tucked away? She blinked hard, refused to fidget, took notes like her job depended on it, which, technically, it did. Barbara stretched languidly in her chair halfway through the meeting and gave a low, knowing smirk. "Well," she drawled, just loud enough to reach across the table. "Someone's had a cozy weekend." Huh. The words slid through the room like oil on tile. Maggie didn't look up, didn't flush, didn't shrink. She wrote the word Tuesday on her notepad and underlined it twice. But before the air had time to twist with laughter, another voice cut in. Sharply, clearly, enough. It was Jonathan. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room snapped into stillness. "We don't pay for pettiness," he said, eyes trained on Barbara now. "Let's not waste each other's time." Barbara blinked, startled for just a breath before regaining her practiced smile. "Of course," she murmured, smoothing her blouse like it was the shirt's fault. Jonathan moved on immediately, returned to the agenda. Efficiency reasserted itself like a coat pulled tight against the wind. But for 1 second, just one, his eyes met Maggie's. And then, just as quickly, they looked away. The meeting ended 10 minutes early. Maggie returned to her desk, typed the minutes, filed the follow-ups, answered 3 emails, and scheduled a vendor call. Her body went through the motions, but her thoughts stuck in loops. Maybe the lake had been a mistake. Maybe what felt meaningful to her had been just a release valve for him. Something temporary, contained. A moment of weakness mistaken for something more. That evening, she walked home. The wind had lost its bite. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that made your own thoughts sound louder. She climbed the stairs to her building, unlocked the door, and found it there, resting against the welcome mat. A cream envelope, no stamp, no return address. Just her name, Maggie, written in neat, careful handwriting that leaned slightly to the right. She picked it up slowly, heart thudding in that cautious way it did when hope and hesitation lived in the same breath. Inside a small bundle of folded paper, handwritten, ink slightly smudged in places, and on top, a note. I want you to know who I was, before the walls. No signature, but she didn't need one. The envelope lay on her kitchen table for nearly an hour before Maggie touched it again. She made tea, fed the cat, changed into her favorite old sweatshirt, the one with sleeves too long and a tiny hole near the cuff. She dimmed the light over the sink, turned off her phone, and then, finally, she sat down. The papers weren't stapled, just gently folded, held together by a thin blue ribbon. The kind of ribbon that looked like it came from a drawer no one had opened in years. She untied it carefully, as if unwrapping something fragile. The first page had no title, no date, just handwriting steady, slanted slightly right, with occasional pauses where the ink darkened, like he'd stopped mid-thought before continuing. I was 6 the first time I saw my father drunk. He sang to the hallway mirror like it owed him an apology, then passed out across the kitchen floor. My mother cleaned up quietly. She always did. Maggie read slowly, not because the words were complicated, but because they weren't. They were plain, honest, sharp in their simplicity, page after page. She followed the thoughts of a boy who lived on the edge of 2 worlds, the chaos of a broken father and the quiet resilience of a woman who never stopped showing up. His mother worked as a secretary for a local insurance firm in St. Paul. She left at 6:00 a.m. every day, rain or snow, carrying a thermos of coffee and a stack of folders she reviewed at the breakfast table. When I was sick, I stayed under her desk. I'd lie there, coloring dinosaurs on legal pads while she typed letters and answered phones and made things run. She always kept a tin of mints in her drawer. I thought they were treasure. There were no dramatic turns in the story, no cliffhangers, no grand conclusions, just glimpses of birthdays forgotten, of long bus rides, of a boy who learned to be small so the world wouldn't notice him break. And then, as the pages shifted, the voice changed not in tone, but in age. Teenage years marked by silence, a scholarship that felt undeserved, a dorm room with no one to call, the first job where he worked 16 hours a day because the office was quieter than his apartment, a brief mention of a marriage, a name Claire that only appeared once, and then the story paused, followed by one final page. I never trusted anyone with this, until now. That was it. No explanation, no signature, just that line deliberate, final, weighty in a way she felt in her ribs. Maggie placed the page gently on top of the others. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath the whole time. It wasn't a love letter. There were no metaphors or sweeping declarations. But it was something deeper, an unguarded offering, a memory without polish, a key left on a doorstep without a lock in sight. She didn't cry, but for a long time, she sat there, her fingers resting lightly on the last page, like holding it too tightly might shatter the silence it carried. The tea had gone cold. The apartment still smelled faintly of rain and lavender dish soap, and she hadn't moved, not until the clock ticked past midnight, and the cat curled up at her feet. She didn't text him, didn't email, didn't knock on his office door the next morning, but she rose early, ironed her blouse, braided her hair the way her mother used to, and walked into the office like a woman who had decided quietly, firmly, that she would carry the weight of someone else's trust, like it mattered. At exactly 8:43 a.m., Maggie stood in front of the elevator on the 7th floor. The manuscript, if it could be called, that was in her hands. She had wrapped the pages carefully in a soft brown folder, closed with a simple paperclip. No note, no additions, just his story, cared for. When the elevator dinged, the doors opened to reveal Jonathan, alone inside. He looked tired, not in the way of missed sleep, but in the way of someone who had handed over a piece of himself and wasn't sure what might be handed back. Their eyes met. She stepped in, didn't say a word, just held out the folder. He took it without speaking. Their fingers didn't touch, but the silence did. And when the doors slid shut behind them, the hum of the elevator was the only sound. Stillness, but not empty, not anymore. Monday's silence had been painful, Tuesday's silence was intentional. Maggie arrived at the office 15 minutes early, not because she had to, but because it mattered to her, because routines were anchors, and today, she needed something to hold on to. The conference room was already prepped for the executive project meeting. Long glass table, bottles of water lined up like soldiers, a tray of croissants no one would touch, brought in by an intern who didn't yet understand how little kindness was noticed here. Maggie walked in like she belonged, not hurried, not hesitant, just present. Barbara was already seated, one leg crossed over the other, tapping her pen rhythmically against her planner. Her glance toward Maggie was casual, but it lingered a second too long. Maggie met the look without blinking. She said nothing, didn't raise her chin, didn't shift her weight. She just walked calmly to her usual chair at the far end of the table, pulled it back, and sat down, opened her notebook, uncapped her pen, breathed. There was power in quiet consistency. She knew that now. Barbara's eyes flicked toward her again, then back to her screen. Around the room, others filtered in, department heads, team leads, voices low with tired chatter and passive updates. But Maggie sat with a stillness that no one could quite ignore. Jonathan entered last. He wore charcoal again, his armor of choice. A navy tie, crisp collar, hair slightly tousled as if he'd run his hand through it too many times that morning. In his left hand, a folded sheet of paper. He tucked it into the inside pocket of his blazer before speaking. Let's begin. The room settled. Updates began, marketing, operations, finance. Maggie took notes with her usual focus, eyes tracking details, hands steady. She wasn't waiting for anything. Not approval, not rescue, not recognition. She was just doing her job. And somehow, that felt like a quiet revolution. Halfway through the meeting, Barbara leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and looked down the table toward Maggie. The smile came first tight, rehearsed, practiced in mirrors that never offered honest reflections. Then the comment, "Well, look at you," she said, voice dipped in syrup. "Our very own executive secretary, or should I say, secret executive." The words drew a soft chuckle from someone at the far end of the table, the kind of laugh people offer when they're not sure who's safe to offend. Maggie looked up slowly, not defensive, not startled, just ready. She met Barbara's gaze with a calm that came from somewhere hard-earned. Then she smiled, gently, without irony. "I earn my place," she said quietly, "every day." The room stilled, not with tension, but with recognition. It wasn't the volume of her words that held the room. It was the truth in them. Jonathan didn't say anything right away. He looked at Maggie, then at Barbara. Then he stood, reached into his blazer, and pulled out the folded sheet of paper he had carried in. "Before we wrap," he said, voice even, "I have one more announcement." A pause. Not for drama, but for impact. He looked around the table. His gaze didn't settle long on anyone in particular, but when it passed over Maggie, something softened at the edges. "We're restructuring administrative leadership," he said, effective immediately. Whispers moved like static along the table. Jonathan continued, "We'll be appointing a new operations liaison officer, someone who understands workflow across departments, someone who's been holding this place together long before we realized it." He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. Maggie sat still, no reaction, but inside some part of her that had been curled tightly for years, began to unfurl. After the meeting ended, Maggie stood slowly. She didn't rush to pack her things. She didn't avoid anyone's eyes. She simply closed her notebook, clicked her pen, and placed both gently into her bag. As she walked toward the door, she passed Barbara. Barbara looked up, searching for something, maybe a crack, maybe a signal. But all she saw was Maggie's steady gaze and a single nod, respectful, unshaken. And then Maggie walked on. That night, she rode the bus home like she always did. Same seat, same quiet hum of traffic. But this time, her reflection in the window didn't look like someone fading. It looked like someone standing her ground, The meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m., not the weekly check-in, not the quarterly report. This one came directly from Jonathan's office. Subject line, realignment briefing. Everyone showed up, even those who usually delegated or delayed, even Barbara, who arrived 5 minutes early, lips painted sharper than usual, phone in hand, fingers dancing over the screen like nothing could touch her. Maggie took her seat as she always did, legal pad open, pen uncapped, posture composed. But this time, something was different. The quiet in the room wasn't the usual pre-meeting hum. It was anticipatory, waiting. Jonathan walked in at exactly 3:01. No papers, no assistant, just him. He wore gray today. The lighter shade, the one that softened the lines on his face and made him look less like a CEO and more like a man who had once learned to survive loss and came back not to conquer, but to rebuild. He stood at the head of the table. No podium, no slides, just words. "We're restructuring," he began. No apology, no lead up, straight to it. Not just roles or responsibilities, culture, values, expectations. The room stilled. His voice remained calm, even measured like stone being laid, one brick at a time. For too long, we've allowed dynamics that breed smallness, whispers in hallways, power plays disguised as banter. He didn't look at Barbara, but he didn't need to. Going forward, he continued, "We're prioritizing something we should have always placed at the center, respect." There was no clapping, no performative nods, just eyes watching, waiting to see where this would land. We're promoting based on merit and ethic, not volume, not popularity, not games played behind conference room doors. Maggie felt something shift, not outside, but within her. She didn't smile, she didn't sit taller, but something that had always coiled tight inside her, loosened. Jonathan's gaze moved across the table, not sweeping, intentional. He acknowledged each face, not with familiarity, but with expectation. And when his eyes met Maggie's, they stayed, longer than was comfortable, longer than she expected, but not to assert, to recognize. Then he turned back to the group. "This isn't about favoritism," he said clearly. "It's about restoring the dignity of the work we do, and of the people who've quietly held it together." That landed. Not like thunder, but like a boundary drawn clearly in the sand. Barbara shifted in her seat, not dramatically, just a slight realignment of her shoulders. But Maggie noticed it, the tightness in her jaw, the quick glance toward the others, the way her fingers froze over her phone screen for the first time all day. For once, she wasn't controlling the room, and Maggie didn't need her to. The meeting wrapped without applause. Jonathan simply nodded, said, "That's all," and stepped back, not out of power, but out of performance. Maggie watched the room, clear people leaving in small pairs, some whispering, others silent. Barbara was one of the first out. No comments this time, no smirk, just the faintest flush of someone who realized the rules had changed mid-game. Maggie stayed seated, not because she was waiting, but because, for once, she wanted to choose her moment. When Jonathan turned to leave, she rose, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. He looked surprised but not startled when she approached. She didn't offer a smile, not right away, just a quiet invitation. "Would you like to go for coffee?" she asked, her voice low. Off the record. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't compliance. It was choice. A grown woman asking for a conversation not because she needed clarity, but because she was ready for truth. Jonathan looked at her, not over her, not through her, at her, and for a second, neither of them moved. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "I'd like that." There were still things unsaid, still shadows in corners, still stories they hadn't touched. But in that moment, in that hallway, beside the glass wall that had once made her feel so small, Maggie stood, not above anyone, not beyond anything, just upright, present, and choosing to stay. The gravel crunched under the tires as Jonathan pulled up to the cabin. This time, there was no storm, no darkness. Just golden afternoon light streaming through the thinning branches and a lake so still it looked like it was listening. Maggie stepped out of the car slowly. The same porch, the same cedar-scented air, but it wasn't the same. She wasn't the same. Jonathan didn't say much as he unlocked the door, just offered a small smile, a nod, and let her step inside first. The cabin felt smaller now, warmer somehow, like it had been waiting for them to return, not as strangers sharing silence, but as people who had started building something, word by word, glance by glance. He rolled up his sleeves as he unpacked a brown paper bag filled with groceries. "Nothing fancy," he said, "just ingredients. Figured we could build the meal together." She smiled. "As long as there's no canned tuna." His laugh was soft, almost surprised. "Deal." They cooked in a quiet rhythm. Maggie sliced vegetables while he stirred a pot of something fragrant and simple: chicken, garlic, rosemary. He found apples in the bag and began preparing a small tart, his fingers surprisingly sure with the crust. "You bake?" she asked. He nodded. "Used to. My mom made pie every Sunday. Apple was her favorite. I tried to keep it going, for a while." There was no sadness in his voice, just memory. Maggie liked that. "I play jazz," she said suddenly, almost shyly. "Well, play might be generous. I took piano lessons for years, mostly old standards. But sometimes, when things are too quiet, I play Duke Ellington in my kitchen." He looked at her like he was seeing something new. "Duke Ellington," he echoed. "You just became 10 times more interesting." The food wasn't perfect, the rice was slightly underdone, and the crust on the tart was a little too thick on one side. But it was theirs. They ate on mismatched plates at the small wooden table near the window, watching the last bit of light dance across the lake. No agenda, no masks. Just two people sitting across from each other with soft eyes and unhurried breath. Later, after the dishes were rinsed and the kitchen cleaned, they sat outside on the porch with mugs of chamomile tea, the kind that tasted like quiet and reminded you to stop chasing the day. The sky was ink blue now, scattered with stars. Maggie pulled her sweater tighter. Jonathan sat beside her, elbows on knees, eyes toward the water. "Do you miss her?" she asked gently. There was no need to name who. He didn't answer right away. Just inhaled, exhaled, slow and steady. Then he nodded. "Every day," he said, "but missing you would be worse." The words didn't come with fanfare. No swell of music, no dramatic pause, just honesty, laid bare in the air between them. He reached for her hand then, not hesitantly, not with possession, but with something closer to reverence. His fingers found hers like they had been waiting a long time to do so. She didn't pull away, didn't speak, but she turned her palm to meet his, fingers curling around his with a quiet certainty. There was no kiss, no rush, just the gentle weight of connection, of trust relearned, choice by choice. The lake lapped softly at the shore. A loon called in the distance. And somewhere in the dark, the pain they both carried stepped back, not vanished, not forgotten, but softened by presence. Inside, the fireplace glowed again. They sat beside it for a while, not needing to fill the space. She leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't shift, just let her be. The next morning, sunlight poured through the window, casting long golden lines across the floor. Maggie stood barefoot in the kitchen, watching Jonathan pour coffee like it was a sacred act. There was something beautiful in the ordinariness of it. He handed her a cup, fingers brushing briefly. They drank in silence, a silence that no longer asked to be explained. As they packed to leave, Jonathan paused by the door, hand resting on the frame. "I'd like you to come to the annual banquet this weekend," he said. His tone wasn't commanding, not even hopeful. Just open, an offering. Maggie blinked, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Do I have to wear sequins?" she teased. He laughed. "Absolutely not. But there will be tiny desserts." "Tempting," she said. But in her eyes, he saw the answer. As they pulled away from the lake, neither of them looked back, because the memory had already made itself a place in both of them, and it no longer needed a view to be real. She almost didn't go, but something in her knew it was time. The dress wasn't extravagant. It was a soft shade of ivory, like the first snow that fell without a sound. Simple neckline, loose sleeves, a modest length that brushed just below her knees. Maggie had found it tucked away in the back of a local boutique, where the clerk said, "This one doesn't shout, but it stays with you." She had smiled then, unsure if it was a compliment or a coincidence. Tonight, it felt like both. Her hair was down, not styled, not curled, just worn the way it always wanted to fall. Free. A little wild at the edges. She wore no necklace, just small pearl earrings her mother had given her years ago, back when Maggie still believed the world needed you to sparkle to be seen. The banquet hall at the downtown Marriott gleamed with soft gold lighting and glass chandeliers that tried too hard. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and cranberry spritzers. The company logo glowed from a screen above the stage, reminding everyone why they were here. Maggie stepped in without hesitation, but her heart still fluttered, like a small bird testing its wings in a wide room. Heads turned, not dramatically, not like in a movie, but enough. The glances were real, curious, lingering, but something was missing from them this time, something she had always expected: judgment. It wasn't there. Barbara saw her first, from across the room, near the bar. Her eyes narrowed, but only for a second. Then she turned away, laughing at something too loudly, too quickly. Maggie didn't flinch. She didn't look for Jonathan, either. Instead, she made her way toward a quiet corner table near the back, one she had sat at in previous years, with plastic forks and lukewarm potatoes and polite conversations about workloads and long weekends. Tonight, she sat alone by choice. A waiter approached. She asked for a glass of apple cider. Not wine, not champagne, just something that tasted like fall, like calm, like home. From where she sat, Maggie watched the room without really watching. People laughing in small clusters, department heads mingling, interns clinging to their name tags like lifeboats. She sipped slowly, feeling the crisp tang of cider coat her tongue. The glass was chilled, the rim slightly wet with condensation. Her fingers left small ovals on its surface. And then, the lights dimmed. A voice from the podium announced the evening's program. Awards, promotions, a video montage with stock music and candid office photos. It all moved in a quiet blur, until the final act. Jonathan stepped onto the stage. He wore a black suit, no tie, collar slightly open. His presence quieted the room in an instant, not with force, but with weight. He didn't look at the camera. He didn't scan the crowd. He looked down at the microphone, then up only once, straight into Maggie's eyes. "I'm not good at speeches," he began. "I've always believed the work should speak louder than the people doing it." Soft chuckles. But this year, the work didn't speak loud enough. A pause. He let the silence settle, like snow. There are people in this room who've held this place together with quiet hands, who've shown up every day, who've carried more than their job titles ever acknowledged. Maggie's heart beat once, hard, then again. Jonathan looked down at the microphone once more, then reached for the switch and turned it off. A murmur swept the crowd, but he didn't explain, didn't elaborate. He stepped down from the podium and walked through the room, not fast, not slow, just forward. Eyes followed, breath held. He passed Barbara, past senior managers, directors, VPs, until he stopped right in front of her. Maggie didn't stand. Not yet. She looked up, waiting, unsure. But then he reached for her hand, not to pull her up, just to hold it, and she rose. Not because he asked, but because she wanted to meet him where he stood. And then, in a room full of applause, half silenced by confusion, half stilled by awe, he kissed her. Not like the first time. Not a whisper of defiance. Not a secret shield against cruelty. This was different. This was with both feet grounded. This was with eyes open. This was a man who had nothing to prove and everything to offer. A kiss not made of rescue. but of recognition. When it ended, they didn't say anything. They didn't have to. She stayed by his side as he turned back toward the room, and the applause returned. This time, louder, this time, not for the company, or the profits, or the numbers on a quarterly slide, but for something they didn't quite understand yet, for the line that had been crossed, and for the woman who had chosen to walk across it with her head held high. The banquet was over. The lights were dimming. The music faded into the corners of the ballroom, and voices began to soften into whispers and goodbyes. Maggie stepped outside into the crisp night, her heels clicking softly on the concrete, snowflakes drifting down like shy confetti. The parking lot stretched out before her, quiet, half empty, blanketed in a light dusting of early December snow. Jonathan was already waiting near her car. No driver, no umbrella, just his coat collar turned up and his hands in his pockets, breath rising in little clouds under the street lamp. He didn't speak right away. He simply looked at her, the way people look at something they hope will stay. They walked, side by side, past rows of cars, beneath the soft orange glow of lights that hummed quietly above them. For the first time all night, there was no one watching. No board members, no whispers, no applause, just footsteps and snow and breathing. "I almost didn't come," she said after a while. He turned slightly, not surprised. "Why did you?" She looked down at the snow collecting on her coat sleeve. I just didn't want to disappear." He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than the words she'd chosen. They reached the far end of the lot, where the asphalt gave way to a patch of trees, branches bare and black against the night sky. Maggie stopped walking, folding her arms for warmth, though the cold didn't really bother her anymore. "I used to dream of owning a bookstore," she said softly. Jonathan tilted his head. "Really?" "Yeah." A small smile. "I even had a name for it when I was a kid. Quiet places, no loud colors, no music, just books, plants, maybe a cat. A little corner for people who don't want to perform." He smiled, not at the dream, but at the way she said it, like it was still somewhere in her. "You'd make a good bookseller," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Because I'm quiet." "No," he said. "Because you'd know what people need before they ask." He reached into his coat pocket then, not nervously, not ceremoniously, just gently, and pulled out a small velvet box. Maggie looked at it, startled. Her breath caught, just for a second. But when he opened it, it wasn't a ring. Inside sat a single silver key. Her brow furrowed, heart racing for reasons she didn't yet understand. Jonathan held the box toward her. "It's a building," he said, "corner of 4th and Main, empty for years, quiet street, big windows." She looked at him, eyes searching. "I thought maybe it was time you were the one behind the desk," he added. A pause, not answering phones, but opening doors. Maggie stared at the key for a long time, not because she doubted it, but because, for the first time in her life, someone had handed her more than a task. He had handed her space. He had handed her possibility. She took the box with slow, deliberate hands, closed it gently, held it to her chest. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," he replied. But then he added, more quietly, "Just don't say goodbye." They walked back toward the entrance in silence again. But this silence felt different, like soil, not stone, like something that could grow things. At the curb, a taxi pulled up. Maggie turned to him before she stepped inside. "Will you come visit?" He smiled. "Only if I get bookstore discounts." She laughed then, really laughed, the sound rising into the cold air like a bell. "I'll even save the jazz records for you," she said. He touched her elbow gently, a soft pressure. "You saved something more important than that." She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. Inside the cab, the heat hummed low. The windows fogged slightly as the driver pulled away. Maggie looked back. The banquet hall still shimmered behind her, lights glowing through tall glass windows, like a dream she'd finally woken from. And then they passed the office building, tall, familiar, silent. She saw the window where her desk had once been, the chair she'd sat in for years, always just out of sight, always slightly behind someone else's spotlight. She didn't feel bitterness. She didn't feel loss, just completion. Once, someone had joked she'd marry her office chair, that it was all she had. But tonight, she left that chair behind, and in its place, she carried a key. She rested her head lightly against the cab window, closed her eyes, whispered into the space between heartbeats. I wasn't saved. I was seen. Sometimes, life doesn't break us with big moments. It wears us down quietly through overlooked efforts, unspoken pain, and years of feeling invisible. Maggie's story reminds us that dignity isn't found in titles or applause. It's in showing up when no one notices, in staying kind when the world turns cold, and in continuing to believe, even if just a little, that we matter. Being seen isn't about being rescued or praised. It's about being recognized for who we truly are, without having to raise our voices or change ourselves to fit in. Sometimes, all it takes is one person who sees past the surface. And sometimes, that person can even be ourselves. This story invites us to slow down and remember, it is never too late to start again. Never too late to choose a different ending. Never too late to believe that quiet strength, lived with grace, is not weakness but power. So, if you've been sitting in the same chair for too long, literally or figuratively, maybe it's time to stand. Not to walk away from your life, but to walk toward the part of it that still believes in you. Thank you for spending your precious time with us, and for listening with an open heart. If this story touched you, even just a little, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to Shining Stories. Your support helps us keep telling the quiet stories that deserve to be heard. Until next time, stay kind, stay seen, stay shining.